Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Brick from 2006. Now, for anybody who has been watching this series from the very first episode, you may remember I talked about this film in the very first episode, or at least the fact that I hadn't seen it. This is the first film made by Rian Johnson. And as I talked about during that first episode in which we watched Knives Out, I think Rian Johnson is very talented. And the more of his content that I watch, the more I feel that's the case. And with the exception of certain elements of Looper, which I don't particularly care for, and The Last Jedi overall, which I think is generally pretty bad. That's a discussion for another time. I like Rian Johnson, and I think he has good ideas, and I think he's a good writer and a good director. And so I'm glad I finally got around to watching this. Not only because I think this film is quite good, but it is very surprising. I was not expecting at all what this film was. And partially that's deliberate, not trying to look into it too much until watching it. But having heard, enough people say, oh yeah, have you seen Brick? That's a weird one. You should watch it sometime. And then not hearing a lot more, it's one of those things that keeps coming up in the back of my mind, but I never think to actually go and watch. Because something about how little I know about it is sort of makes it less accessible or less of a thing that comes to mind. But I really find this film fascinating. For context, I found out after I watched it, the film was made for about $450,000 allegedly. It's made cheap. Nobody would fund it, so he raised funding from family and friends to make it, apparently. And there are certain aspects of the film that definitely show the fact that it is made cheaply. But that is not to say that they ever overextend their capabilities or pretend that they are a bigger production than they are. It's a production that clearly has a good head on its shoulders in terms of knowing what it is and isn't capable of, and the production sacrifices that need to be made in order to make a movie like this for that kind of money. It stars a bunch of people who are relatively minor names now, or were at the time, with Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who's, to be fair, not even a big time actor, but he's, a notable name, probably the most notable on the list. When they're very young. And there's a bunch of names on the actors list who are sort of small character actors who I've seen, some of whom I've seen in a few things, some of whom I've seen in a lot. And for Rian Johnson to cast all these people, or for the production in general, I should say, to cast all these people and work with a bunch of very young actors and have them put on the kind of performances that they put on here is impressive in its own right, let alone for the kind of money that they did it for. What's even more impressive is that this is a movie that does things I've never seen any other movie do before, or at least not with this kind of competence. I'm just going to go ahead and do some minor tone spoilers at the beginning because I don't think they're really that spoilery, and you'll get it within the first 5 minutes of watching the film. But caveat emptor. The movie is essentially a noir. And that is a weird thing to say because everything about the surface level presentation says that it is a high school teen drama. And when you say, I want to make a noir film set in a high school, that sounds like a disaster, right? Like if somebody had told me that, I would have been extremely skeptical. Because it sounds like even if you have written something competently enough for that to make sense at all, that when you try and mix those things together, you're going to have tonal clashes that absolutely rip it to shreds from the inside. There are a few movies I can think of that do these sort of tone mashups or setting mashups in interesting ways. And some of them I do really like, even when they're deeply flawed. One of the ones I thought of most was Romeo plus Juliet, which is a bizarre film that I really enjoy, but it's not good. And it is fascinating for its artistic attempts and this juxtaposition of modern settings and certain like modern cultural things as contrasted against Shakespearean language. But it ultimately, the novelty of it is what's interesting about it. The fact that you have these deliberately clashing elements, and it's as a result never gets away from being kind of cheesy. By comparison, this movie, Brick, is on the opposite side of the spectrum, where I am still stunned at how well blended the deeply unflinching noir elements of this film are mixed with the wholly unmodified setting of a high school in Southern California somewhere. It's the kind of thing that should collapse in every scene, where you would think that the tone would come off as cheesy, that it should come off like some sort of student film where they didn't have the production value to do any of the setting stuff for an actual noir film, so they just set it at their high school. But on the contrary, it manages to unironically and like without irony and without without humor, it genuinely portrays itself internally as a noir, if that makes sense. The movie and the characters in it are so much in the noir vein. They are noir archetypes. They speak in certain ways, and it should just fall apart. But it is so honest and earnest in its portrayal of these characters, and the way they talk to each other is so unflinchingly true to that tone that it just sort of skates by on it. Like it's not distracting at all, except for, at least for me, like after the first like minute or two, it's completely sort of seamless. And the only time it was really notable to me that like, oh, this is a weird high school noir thing, are the moments when I was like really stunned at how good it was. Not the times when it took me out of it, because it really didn't very much. So much of the like structure of a noir film, the detective, the like down on his luck detective, the, you know, these various character archetypes, the mobsters, the femme fatales, the like woman in distress, all these other things are like, it doesn't even have to try that hard. And I think that's kind of why it works. It doesn't have to try and find where to put those archetypes in a high school setting. They fit very naturally. And it's not a thought that I ever would have had to be like, oh yeah, this is so weird how these things can totally line up naturally. You're not like forcing these characters in. It's like, no, drama, this drama geek is this archetype, and the nerd kid the nerd loner is this one, and all these other things. Like, it just works. It works beautifully. And in yet another should be a nail in the coffin, but manages to elevate it that much more. And in yet another reflection on a sort of Shakespearean thing, and is that it goes even further than to like use. Nobody's doing like that hokey noir accent, but none of them talk like high schoolers. Like they waver in and out a little bit, but it's never distracting, because they go from like just normal high schoolers to like borderline absurd caricatures of tragic, like either tragic figures or noir archetypes or these other things. And the language that they use for the most part is, if you really focus on it, bizarre and not how anyone ever has talked. But it's so smartly written that's never a distraction. It's so charming, and I can't even put a name to the way the language is structured, because like I said, it's not really noir. It's something wholly new. It has a rhythm to it that is indescribable. But it feels so natural, both for a noir type film and weirdly for a high school film. Something about the structure of the dialogue feels very jazzy, and the word choice feels bizarrely noir. But then the actual interactions that are being portrayed are wholly in the realm of that sort of high school, post-high school thing. The interactions between all of these characters are fit perfectly. I never said the interactions between these are not two high school kids putting on a show of being noir archetypes. These are high school kids just talking in a different way. And I wish I could describe that better, but even if I wanted to spoil the movie more, I don't know that I could do it justice. It's a script unlike any other I've ever seen, and I can certainly understand why nobody ever would have picked it up. Even now, I don't think anybody would read this script and go, yeah, this seems like it should work. In addition to like this weird setting and these odd characters that are a mishmash of genres, because it is very grounded in this high school setting visually as well. And there's something to be said for the sort of griminess that comes from this film stock that was used. My understanding is that they just used like a basic 35 millimeter film stock, and there's definitely some elements of it that show that. But that's not to say that it's like that the camera operation is incompetent or anything like that. On the contrary, I think there's a lot of really good work that uses the I don't want to say inadequacies, but the problems with using 35 millimeter film and cheaper cameras, non-traditional cameras, and these other things that make the sort of grimy nature of it a little bit more intense. And I think that works really well. The settings, the locations, and all these things are also simultaneously like, yes, these are just locations that like some high schoolers would have be in and out of, in their day-to-day, week-to-week. But also feel weirdly appropriate for a noir setting. And while it's not, it's not so cliche as like, the the detective's office with the glass panel with his name on it or anything like that. There's lots of locations that I think are perfect analogies, perfect visual metaphor for their noir, their noir counterpoints. And I don't want to call out any specific because I think a lot of them are really good, and also specifying any given one might be edging into spoilers. There are some interesting costuming choices. For the most part, most of the characters dress exactly like you'd expect them to dress for their high school archetypes. But there are certainly some characters that stray into the absurd. But it's also kind of a perfect setting in that way, because anybody who went to a public high school or went through that sort of era of growth and hung out with more than one group of people certainly knows some of the odd behaviors that high schoolers get up to, including how they dress themselves and how they portray themselves and the idiosyncrasies of a growing high schooler's mind. And so you can easily write off some of these sort of more explicit visual nods towards noir genre things as just like, that's just this weird person in high school going through something where they're like, I just want to wear this today, or that sort of thing. And I think it works really well as a result. It's not the same kind of thing that you could do in a lot of other settings. If these were all adults, I think some of these the conceit would not mesh up as well and not be as believable, because they're high schoolers. They're fucking weird. And so it is kind of fun to see how they play with some of the costuming, and how much of that is supposed to be taken like wholly seriously as this is exactly as it is in world, versus like how much of this is purely artistic choice, because that's how they want this to look, because they want to use this visual moment to remind you of these noir beats, these noir comparisons. Boy, I'm like all over the place on this movie because it's really hard to talk about. And it's the kind of thing I'm definitely going to have to go back and watch again. I think the tone overall is really, really solid. Like I said, I think for all these things that should be sort of starkly contrasting, the overarching narrative that it tells and the tone that it keeps is very consistent throughout. And while it never strays away from, no, these people are definitely in high school, the tone is very much more in that drama, thriller, detective mystery thing. And striking the balance between the two is just crazy impressive. That's also facilitated by other elements of the filmmaking itself. I think the cinematography, while sometimes somewhat amateurish and sometimes sacrificed in certain ways by virtue of the budgetary constraints, has some really smart and interesting camera work and even throughout the film, there's a variety of different styles that show up visually, um, using all kinds of different like cinematic techniques. There's handy cam stuff. There's wide shots on moving tripods. There's dolly footage. There's all different sorts of things, and I think they're all used really well to serve the tone of any given scene or shot. And for all the the issues of the budget, I think there's some really nice cinematography that goes on here, and some shots in particular, I can think of like 2 or 3 that are just like, wow, that's really cool. I've never seen anybody do that with a camera before in a big budget film, or even at all. And the whole thing is really nicely capped off with a combination of good editing, that brings the narrative together and keeps the pacing really solid, and some really good music that tends to stay out of the way, except for at the moments when it's really needed. And I think it's all original tracks for the film. It's very noir in its composition, but is sort of modern enough. It doesn't, it's not just jazz. It's not just, the noir standards, the brass and bass and, and drums. It takes a lot of the same sort of musical ideas, and reinterprets them and uses them very sparingly. So you hear some of those same sort of audio cues that remind you of noir, but are distinctly different and distinctly modern in their composition, and interwoven throughout the editing and used sparingly. I think it does, yet again, a really nice job of balancing between these two disparate things of high school drama and sort of noir, neo-noir. And overall, I really like what it comes down to. I think there's some elements of the film narratively that I was certainly not expecting, knowing little about the film, and are a little bit troubling. But that is sort of, that is a weird thing as well, as there's a lot of things we just take for granted in certain genres where noir is, sex, drugs, and murder. And when you transpose some of those things to another genre, while they still work really well, they sometimes become more impactful, or even possibly too impactful as a result, because of that sort of genre recontextualization. And so I would really be interested to go back and rewatch this and find out how I feel about it, knowing the beats and the how the mysteries unfold and who's got what motivations. And I feel like I could focus more on the composition as a whole and a little bit less, while still, of course, appreciating the mystery itself. So this is a pretty fascinating film on its own. I think it's really well made, but especially for something made for so little money, and apparently it's shot in like 20 days as well, and with a pretty substantial cast too. Like, the cast list is not short. It's not like 5 people. There's a lot of scenes. There's a bunch of locations. There's some great writing, great production, just smart and interesting and unique, and I'm really pleased with it. It's probably not going to go on like an all-time greats list of any kind, but for me, but there's certainly a lot to reflect upon coming off of it. And yeah, I don't know. I'm definitely gonna have to watch it again. Anyway, if you've seen this film, let me know. I don't feel like it's something that it made its money back many times over, but it's still like kind of a cult film, not very well known. So if you happen to have seen it, let me know your thoughts. I find it really interesting, and it once again makes me want to see what Rian Johnson can do when he's not hampered by Disney. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.